Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll get started.
This story begins in the Pendragon Empire, where there was a very strict hierarchy. There was royalty and nobility, as well as commoners and slaves. And at the very bottom of all these people were the Rediots, slaves of slaves. They were the most ordinary people with red hair, who once lived peacefully on a barbarian continent. But there they were captured by citizens of the empire, transported to another place and forced to live as slaves under the name of Rediots. Even though they were human, they were treated like unwanted cattle simply because they had a different hair color. It was only natural for them to react in this way, because the idea of a Rediot, a man who is even lower than an animal, is simply disgusting. However, this story will tell about a girl who is exactly like that. One day she crossed paths with some men in a dark alley. There was some kind of celebration in the empire then, because there were fireworks all around them, and when these knights stopped her, she asked them not to do what they were planning. Even though the girl had rehearsed this line many times, her body still couldn't react any differently. The words simply couldn't come out of her mouth, and she just stood there shaking with fear. One of the knights was very surprised and asked what it was. He did not understand why she had called them so secretly, and expected that there would be something interesting and entertaining. But in the end, she turned out to be just a stuttering slave. He, even getting angry, said that he was already starting to get tired of all this. The girl herself, whose name was Catherine, realized that she had to gather her courage to do this. She couldn't let their interest go to waste right now, so she gathered her courage and removed her hood, and then the men saw red hair. As soon as she did this, she smiled and asked them to punish her. But at that moment, one of the knights was very surprised and asked the stages to hold their horses, noticing that this hair color was rather strange, and asked if she was really a Rediot. Then the man started yelling at her, asking if she was serious about asking to sleep with a dirty savage like her. He said that it was absurd and she shouldn't even think about it. The knight began to leave and said that he would rather drown himself in alcohol than touch someone who was even lower in rank than a beast. Of course, the girl put the hood back on her head and was even a little upset. But she should have expected such a reaction, because she really was a Rediot. She belonged to a race of red-haired barbarians, the so-called smart monkeys. Then one of the knights turned to his companion, asked him to wait for a while, and also asked him if this was not the Duchy of Caliber. His friend said that it was indeed so, and the guy then added that in that case, this girl could not be a simple Rediot. The man was a little surprised and asked what he meant. The knight then explained to his companion that she was the illegitimate child of Duke Caliberd, half noble blood, half Rediot blood. So he said that she was definitely the one from the rumors about the illegitimate daughter. The boy got tired of listening to all this. He started shouting again and asked what was wrong with it, because dirty blood doesn't disappear just because she's half a noblewoman. His partner tried to calm him down and told him to pay attention, because the late emperor had recently betrothed her to his son, and in front of them now stood Catherine Leborn, the bride of the former emperor Demus. The moment the knight heard this, he immediately became interested. He slowly turned towards the girl, because he could not believe that this could be true. He looked at Catherine and asked in a quiet voice, was she really the bride of the former Emperor Demus? After thinking for a while, he came closer to her and said that in that case, all this was becoming interesting to him. Without thinking twice, he grabbed poor Catherine by her beautiful red fiery hair, so hard that it even hurt her a lot. The man pulled her closer to him and then told his partner that she had a pretty good face for an idiot. But thinking about it, he said that it was still rather strange. Even if she was supposed to have a place in the coats of arms of the departed emperor, he did not understand why she was making such an intimate request to them in an alley. The girl smiled and said that in fact there was no specific reason for this. It was just that the lowly Rediot blood running through her veins couldn't hold back any longer, and it was driving her crazy with impatience. So she decided to use the services of other people. Catherine took his hand and placing it on her chest, thereby pushing away the cross that hung from her, said that he could do absolutely anything he wanted with her. Of course, the man was a little surprised at first, because he did not expect to see such abrupt movements from her. But then the guy laughed loudly. Removing his hand from her, he began to scream again. But this cry was already more emotional. He said that, as expected, the Rediots have a very dirty mind, and even if their blood is mixed at least half, they still behave like animals. But still, despite all this, he agreed to her services and said that she was probably grateful that he would make her evening unforgettable. Catherine, smiling, said that of course, and in order to always remember this evening, She really wanted him to leave many marks on her body. The man, smiling dirty, came closer to her and began to put his hand under her skirt, asking what she would do if he treated her roughly. Not waiting for an answer, he said that when Duke Demus saw the damage, he would probably lose his darling. And then suddenly, thinking, he wondered, is this really what she is striving for? Of course, all this was very terrible for Catherine to experience. This man was simply disgusting. However, everything went exactly according to her plan. In fact, it all started with a confession that she heard that very same day. She was sitting quietly in her living room, drinking tea, when suddenly someone came to her and told her some very unexpected news. It was a man, and he turned to Catherine and said that she was not, in fact, his half-sister by blood. Her cup of tea aside and turning to her brother, asked what he meant. The blonde man didn't even bother to look at her and said that in fact he and she were just strangers, and there is not a single drop of blood from their Caliburna family flowing in her body. This man was Lancelot, who was the current duke of their empire. Of course, as soon as the girl heard this news, she could not believe it. With a trembling voice, she asked, "Does he really mean that the only blood in her body is Redio's blood?" He replied in a sad and quiet voice that it was indeed so. But at that moment, Catherine's life simply collapsed. She certainly didn't expect to hear such a truth. In fact, she was born from Duke Caliburn and a woman who was a Rediot slave. They all said that she was an illegitimate child. However, in the end, it all turned out to be untrue. And the girl realized that if this was really so, then she was now nothing more than a simple beast. Catherine's hands were shaking with fear, and she knew that if the people around her found out about all this, she would be thrown into a pigsty and forced to live a life worse than that of an animal. But then suddenly, the thought came into her head that there was a person who should not know about this under any circumstances. Her fiancé, Demus Pendragon, once the crown prince. In fact, he suddenly killed his father, who was the emperor at the time, and destroyed half of the noble families in his empire. With bloody hands, he seized the throne of the emperor, but despite fears that he would become a tyrant, he gave the crown to his younger half-brother because he thought it would be better that way. By choosing instead to live as a former emperor, this inscrutable, ruthless man may discover that Catherine is pure Rediot. If this does happen, he will use this information as a pretext to accuse the Caliburn family of giving the beast as a bride to a member of the royal family. And in that case, not only the girl herself, but the entire Caliburn family will be mercilessly executed. So after thinking about all this, she turned to her brother and said that they should break off the engagement before her fiancé found out the truth. Lancelot, hearing of this, said that he knew it very well, and that was why he planned to ask for an annulment during Charlotte's birthday banquet, when he himself was to be present. And if the girl could use her illness as a reason, then he wanted to know if that would be an acceptable way. Catherine said that she could certainly do that, but asked if he thought it was all weak, and also asked if the royal family would really allow them to go to such a trivial matter as illness. She said that right now the royal family desperately needs this arranged marriage with the Caliburns, and they are trying to dilute the image of the current throne being built on rebellion, which means that if they demand an annulment and upset the royal family, it could only make their situation worse. She replied that it would be much safer to force the former emperor to raise the issue of annulment himself. When he heard about this, he asked her if she had also already thought about breaking off this engagement, and also asked if she would regret it. Catherine said that of course not. She never wanted this engagement at all, so it wouldn't be a problem. Then her brother said that they must quickly come up with a good plan to ensure that the engagement was annulled. Of course, Catherine agreed with him, but she wasn't sure how she could do it at all. For the former emperor to initiate the annulment, there is little simple justification. And even if Catherine pretends to be crazy, he can just lock her in a room for the rest of her life, but still marry her. Therefore, the girl understood perfectly well that she needed something much more serious and tough, something that could touch the purity of her body and soul. In fact, in the Pendragon Empire, the purity of the bride is considered a very important condition for marriage, especially among the conservative upper class. And if Catherine shows him a very scandalous and wrong side of her right before the wedding, then he will definitely call off this terrible engagement. So as humiliating as it was for Catherine, she found herself in a dark alley with some horny knight. She understood that she just needed to experience all this at least once, and it would all be over. She would achieve what she needed, and she would be able to leave. But at that moment, she realized that something strange was happening, because nothing was happening, and Catherine decided to open her eyes to see what it was. When the girl did this, she saw a very surprising picture, because behind this knight stood a man with a very thin knife, holding it right to his face. The man holding the gun immediately looked at Catherine and greeted her with a smile on his face. This man had hair that shimmered in the moonlight, as well as a voice that cut through the air with a chilling cold, and this man was Demus. The man stood and looked at her, smiling, and Catherine was horrified because she did not understand what he was doing in this place. Meanwhile, the knight asked in a trembling voice if this was really his highness. His body was shaking all over, and he said that he really did ask for forgiveness because he had committed an unforgivable sin, and he was very sorry. So he asked the man to spare his life if it was not too difficult. But Demus was not going to listen to all this. He hit the man right in the stomach, and he fell to the ground. The boy started coughing violently because he had broken several of his ribs. Then the former emperor put his boot on his head and said that if he had really committed a mortal sin, then he should die. But Catherine, who had been standing silently all this time, came up to him and asked him to stop, because she also had something to say about this. As soon as Demus heard this, he immediately became interested and asked her what she wanted to tell him, because he was already impatient to kill this man. In fact, at that very moment, the Duke's family was throwing a lavish banquet in honor of the birthday of their second daughter, Charlotte, so everyone around was very happy. Catherine knew that on such a beautiful day, the death of a knight from another house would bring nothing but trouble, so she had to make her fiancé more reasonable. The girl, plucking up her courage, said in an uneven voice that it was all her fault. She was the one who initiated all this, so his crime did not go beyond the limits of a concerted misconduct. Catherine also said that if he continued this hasty execution, it would only ruin the honor of his youth. She, lowering her head, said that she very humbly asked him to reconsider his decision and think about it. For a while, Demus actually thought about it, but after that, he removed his boot from the man's head and said that he couldn't believe that it was really so. But he also said that since it was true, he could not execute him. The knight even burst into tears at that moment and began to thank his highness for such mercy. The boy, kneeling, said that he would never forget the mercy the man showed that day. But he got tired of listening to all this, and he just went and cut off the poor guy's hand. When the knight realized what had happened, he began to scream loudly. Blood was pouring everywhere, and Demus calmly began to wipe his dagger. Catherine tried not to look in that direction, because she knew she would just throw up. She turned to his highness with a trembling voice and asked what he had done. But the man, continuing to smile, answered in a calm voice that he did not understand why she was unhappy, because he did not kill him, as she said. Demus also said that he dared to touch the Empress, the emperor's covered one, with his dirty hand, so he could not allow him to keep her. The guy looked to the side at the second knight and asked why he was still standing there, and also told him to immediately take his friend, and they left. He immediately took his partner, and they went in the other direction. And so, when Demus and his wife were left alone, he was very happy about it. The guy came closer to Catherine and said that she herself knew perfectly well that he had long wanted to ask her one thing. Although it was a little intrusive on his part, he suddenly stabbed the dagger into the wall that was behind Catherine, so that the weapon remained there despite the concrete tiles. The girl even closed her eyes in fear, but when everything calmed down and Demus ran his hand over her face, he asked why his bride, to the extent that the slave was interested, should relax with other men. The girl just stood there and trembled with fear. She didn't answer him. Then he, moving his hand closer to her lips, asked her to answer him. He asked what her real original plan was. Of course, Catherine hadn't expected them to meet so suddenly and couldn't come up with any excuse. However, since this is the good opportunity she was looking for, she needs to remain vigilant and seek to have their engagement annulled. So she put on an innocent expression and said that no one knew because she was a simpleton and couldn't resist the urge to be with him. Catherine also said that since part of her is a beast, these needs are simply impossible to suppress in herself. And even now, she is on the verge of losing her mind from a beastly desire. At this point, Catherine fell silent and really hoped that he would say that a woman like her was not at all worthy of bearing the title of his wife. But Demus at that moment took his dagger out of the wall and said that in the Empire, they say that she is the greatest invention of Protheon Caliborn, her father, and he is known as the best inventor. He brought the dagger closer and closer to her throat and even ran the tip of the knife so that blood appeared. The man wondered if all this was just a lie. Catherine couldn't understand if he was angry at all and what his reaction would be next. However, she understood that if all this became known to society, that she was half beast and would be disgraced and condemned, then she would rather save the lives of her so-called family and simply die alone now than let them down. So smiling, the girl said that it was indeed true. It was all a lie. She explained that the scientists who came to observe her all said the same thing, that she was an incredibly smart and powerful girl, because she was able to quickly understand their lessons. But Catherine said they were all wrong because she was essentially vulgar, shameless, and not at all as smart as they thought. But then suddenly, Demian interrupted her and said that she was also incredibly beautiful. The girl, hearing about this, immediately looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant. But the man replied that, regardless of whether it was luck or not, she had incredible beauty. Catherine was very surprised. She couldn't believe that he actually said all this, because she had never heard anything like it before. She also suggested that it was likely an insult simply disguised as a compliment. But the man continued to stand next to her. He adjusted her hair with a dagger and said that even the color of her hair looked like bloodstains, and he really thought this was fantastic. After that, he said that his fiancée was in such pain because of all this, so he couldn't just watch it all. Demus moved closer to her and asked if it would be right to just ignore her needs like that. As soon as Catherine heard this, she was very surprised. She could not believe that he was actually telling her such a thing. But at that moment, the man began to slowly open her mouth and then stuck his fingers in there. The girl stood there simply perplexed. She didn't understand what was happening at all, but she also felt a rather strange feeling inside herself. After a while, he removed his fingers from her, and Catherine, breathing heavily, looked at him. Wiping her mouth from her own drool that had flowed out, she wondered if he really just wanted to punish her like this now. But the man was very surprised when he heard what she was saying, that he was punishing her. And he asked if these were the sounds she made when someone was trying to punish or offend her. Without thinking twice, he moved closer to her and placed her hand on his intimate place. In fact, the man was already very excited, and he whispered in her ear, asking what it was like, if she liked feeling this connection. Catherine immediately turned red because she knew what was happening. Everything was swollen down there. She had never seen anything like it, but she had always heard about it. The girl lowered her head down so as not to look at him, and the man told her not to look there for too long, because he was more shy than he might seem. But after that, Damon grabbed both of her hands and lifting them up, began to hold them tightly, saying that his dear half-blood bride seemed rather rude, and preferred to be treated that way. So the man asked if he had understood her hints correctly, and if he knew his future bride well. When Catherine looked at his eyes, which were like those of a predator, ready to hunt its prey at any moment, she felt a little creepy. In fact, when she sees those eyes, she feels like all her secrets and plans could be revealed at any moment. So she must remain calm and act, playing her role until the very end. Catherine smiled and began to breathe heavily and said that of course he was right, and so she asked him to stop teasing her already and do something with her body already. Damon didn't think long. He immediately moved closer to her and began to kiss the girl passionately on the lips, not even letting her breathe. When he pulled away from her after a while, Catherine realized that it was all quite scary. She was, of course, very scared, but at the same time she felt somehow unusual. After the man had been studying her for a while and practically devouring the girl with his eyes, he again pressed his lips to hers and began to kiss. He pressed her harder and harder against the wall, and Catherine couldn't understand if this was really how a kiss was supposed to feel. It felt like she was being eaten from the inside out. She thought that if things continued like this, she would simply stop breathing, because he really didn't let her breathe because of his passion. They continued kissing for a while, but then suddenly Catherine realized that she couldn't breathe at all, so she moved away from the man and began to cough heavily. At that moment, Damon ran his finger over her lips, on which his warmth still remained. The man turned to her, calling her darling, and asked if someone who claimed to have their share of fun couldn't handle a simple kiss. Catherine understood that in this way she was losing her role, and clearing her throat again, said that it was all because she had once received only tender attention. But this was something else. As soon as the man heard this, he immediately began to laugh, and Catherine, angry, did not understand why he was suddenly laughing. But when the man finally calmed down, he looked at her and said that now he was very interested in who was her first. As soon as Catherine heard this rather personal and not very pleasant question for her, she asked if he really wanted to know who her first partner was. The man immediately shook his head, and the girl, when she was about to answer something, felt simply awful. Her head began to hurt so much that she even felt like it was going to split into several pieces. She did not understand why this happened now. At such an important moment, she had to stay healthy, but alas, the headache overtook her again. When the attack passed, Catherine was about to answer him, but at that moment someone's voice was heard behind them. It belonged to her brother Lancelot, who came to her with a guard of knights and finally found the girl. When Damon turned back and saw her brother, he immediately smiled because he certainly didn't expect to see him. Lancelot immediately began to approach his sister and said that a long time had passed since they last saw His Highness. He also explained to the man that he had simply been looking for his little sister since she had gone missing and that she had ended up in such a place. He also said that she looked like she was in a very bad way, so he had decided to take her back. He took his sister by the hand and said that it was time for them to go. Of course, Catherine was very surprised, but she really felt very bad, and she had to go with him. Damon at this point said that she really didn't look her best, that she was sick, and advised her to be a little more gentle towards a sick person. As soon as the guy heard this, he immediately stopped. He looked at the man and asked what he meant. Lancelot at this point couldn't understand how this guy could have brought Catherine to such a terrible state, and now he's pretending not to care, but trying to give some pointless advice. He raised her with such care and love, surrounded the girl with attention, and now he was very surprised that Catherine had sunk to such a level. Having calmed down a little, he turned to His Highness and said that he was, of course, grateful to him for his advice, but he would deal with all this as he saw fit, since this was not the first time something like this had happened. Catherine tried to appeal to her brother and asked him to wait for a while, but she felt so bad that she even had to remain silent for a while to catch her breath. She sighed heavily and said that she felt a headache coming back. She wanted to say what it was more like, but she couldn't because she had lost consciousness. Damon, who was standing next to her, caught the girl, and because of this she did not fall to the ground. But her brother was very worried, because this had never happened before. She had never lost consciousness. Some time passed since then, and Catherine finally woke up. At first she didn't understand where she was, but then she saw that she was lying in her room. In fact, before she fainted, her brother found her and she was very happy about it. However, the flickering light that came from the candle next to her bed was starting to make her headache worse. She would have loved to blow it out, but her body was so heavy that she couldn't even lift her hand. Catherine was just lying there looking at the candle, but then she suddenly saw someone starting to approach her and was very surprised. Catherine was immediately glad that this man came up and put out the candle, because she immediately felt better. The tension eased a little, her eyes and headache rested. She thanked the man, but she could not see his face because it was too dark to see anything. She assumed it was most likely her brother, because after all, the only people who were kind to her in this place were her brother and her father. Several hours passed since then, and finally morning came. Catherine woke up. Despite the fact that she had not slept well, she began to feel a little better. When the girl raised her head up, she saw that someone else was in her room, because she heard something fall. But when the girl looked more closely, she saw that it was Charlotte, and was very surprised by this. Catherine immediately screamed and asked what she was doing in her room. The young girl quickly hid something behind her back and smiled nervously. She began to avoid Catherine's gaze and said that the girl had not woken up, although breakfast had long since passed. But at that moment, Catherine noticed that her box, in which rather precious things were kept, was open, and she did not understand why this was so. The girl quickly jumped out of her bed and asked Charlotte if she had really touched her father's memorabilia. But the girl just smiled and asked how such a vile animal like her could even pronounce this word. She had no right to call this man her father. She looked at Catherine and said that her mother had told her absolutely everything. And so Charlotte replied that the girl did not have a drop of her father's blood at all. She was a radiant. Still mocking, she pointed to the box she was holding and had taken from Catherine, and asked if she really thought it was not too expensive and responsible to keep and possess such a precious thing, since it was lower in status than an animal. After this, Charlotte began to turn around and leave, saying that Catherine was no longer her sister. She was a savage. The girl ran after her and said that she understood everything perfectly, but asked her to put the music box back. Catherine explained that it was a very important and priceless gift, filled with memories of her father, and she did not want it to go to waste. Of course, Charlotte was incredibly angry when she heard about this, because her father, who was related to her by blood, left her nothing to remember himself by, no jewelry. So she thought it was unfair and told Catherine that she would not give anything back at all. The girl at that moment ran to her and asked, "Is she really doing this seriously?" Charlotte, feeling a strong pain in her head, wondered, "Did she really just touch her amazing hair?" Catherine replied that it was just a misunderstanding. She only wanted to take her music box back and not cause her any pain or harm. But her sister said that she was lying, because with her highlighter hair color, she was probably jealous of her graceful curls, which looked completely normal. However, because the two of them were arguing and pushing each other so much, the vase that the flowers were in was knocked over along with some sheets of paper that were lying on the table. As soon as Catherine saw this, she was simply furious, because these were her notes for playing music. She ran away from her sister very quickly and said that everything was now wet, and Charlotte, proudly raising her head up, replied that it was all because she pushed her. But Catherine said it was incredibly important because it contained the notes for a song her father had composed for her. As soon as Charlotte heard this, she became even more angry. She couldn't believe that the girl was trying to brag about this. Without thinking twice, she became so angry with her that she threw the box, it smashed on the floor, and the girl said that in that case, she would give her the box and asked her to stop whining like a little child. Catherine sat there in shock for a moment. She couldn't believe that this had actually happened. But Charlotte, ignoring her, simply walked out the door and had no intention of having any further contact with this person. Catherine continued to scream and asked her to stay a little longer. And then she asked, "Did I really have to go that far?" She didn't understand what the girl had achieved in the first place. At that moment, Charlotte ran up to her mother and burst into tears, and Catherine, walking with wet and crumbling notes in her hand, followed her out. The woman hugged her daughter and asked her to calm down and tell her what happened. The girl, trembling all over, told her mother that Catherine frightened her incredibly and that she had offended her. The woman continued to calm her daughter and said that she wanted to hear a normal explanation because she did not understand anything at all. And Charlotte answered that she did not break the box on purpose. She did not do it intentionally. It happened by a ridiculous accident. The woman stroked her head and said that she knew better than anyone that she was not the kind of child who would do such things on purpose. So she asked the girl to calm down. After this, the woman looked at Catherine with a murderous look and said that she did not know what had happened between the two of them. However, she wondered, did she really need to frighten poor Charlotte so much? As soon as the girl heard this, she was very surprised. She could not believe that Charlotte had actually turned the situation around so that now she was to blame. But, not forgetting her manners, she made a curtsy and, turning to Madame, said that she begged forgiveness for the inconvenience caused. But after that, Catherine decided to defend herself and said that Charlotte had intentionally damaged the memento from her father, and that was why this argument had occurred between them. But the lady interrupted her and said that she could compensate for all this, so she did not consider it necessary to bring the child to such a state of hysterics. Catherine was very surprised that she was trying to bribe her, and so she said that it was impossible. The woman believed that it would be quite enough if she replaced it with exactly the same thing. Also, before leaving, she added that in the end, it was wrong to give a gift to only one person, thereby exalting her to the first place, and there is no point in blaming for all the troubles the one who is no longer with them. Before finally leaving for her business, the woman also warned Catherine that if anything happened to her daughter, she asked the girl to tell her directly about it. The lady wanted her to do so, and not to frighten poor Charlotte in the first place. Also, the women were annoyed that such a mess had occurred in the morning because of some music box. Of course, Catherine was very angry because no one understood her and did not even think that this box was incredibly valuable to her. After a while, she got ready and went outside to get some fresh air. She still had the notes in her hands and couldn't get the thought of that box out of her head. Of course, it was a thing that was filled with memories of her father, and the girl simply did not understand how she could say such things at all. But now, thanks to Charlotte, her heart and memories were all broken. So the only thing that Catherine still had left in memory of her father was the tower, which she had just come to. In her childhood, on the days when her heart was broken, she would always go up to that tower in complete solitude, where no one came or went. She could sit there and think about different things. And one day, her father noticed where she was going, and instead of being angry that a small child was going to such a dangerous place alone, he supported her. He took her hand and climbed up the tower with Catherine, so that now she would not be so lonely and sad. The man always supported her. And when Catherine looked back, all her memories of her father were created precisely thanks to this very tower. And even if her music box was now completely broken, that tower and everything they did there created new and more important memories for her. So without thinking twice, Catherine immediately began to climb up and thought about how when her father stopped the piano in the tower in order to make music, she was so surprised that it is difficult to describe. However, as soon as she began to rise higher and higher, she suddenly heard something strange. Some kind of music was playing in the very top room of this tower. Of course, no one except Catherine knew about this place, so she couldn't come. However, she clearly heard music coming from there. The girl was very angry. After all, no one except her had the right to play her father's piano, so she very quickly overcame the remaining steps and entered this room. And as soon as the girl saw this man, she was very surprised. And all because it turned out to be His Highness. He was sitting calmly and playing the piano. Catherine did not have time to say a single word, because she was very surprised by the man she saw there. But Demus saw her immediately, stopped playing and greeted Catherine, wishing her good morning and, of course, smiling. Although the girl was surprised, she immediately greeted him, and the man told her not to just stand there on the threshold, but to go inside and sit down. Catherine immediately did the same, and also asked his forgiveness for interrupting his game. When she took the cloak off her shoulders and sat down on the floor on the carpet, she said that she had not expected to see him in such a place at all, and asked how he had found out about it at all. Demus, immediately thinking, replied that he was very glad that she was feeling better that day and ignored her question. He looked at the girl with cunning and said that last night, after just one kiss, she lost consciousness and asked if she had any idea how uncomfortable it made him. As soon as Catherine heard this, she immediately felt awkward herself, because it was not because of the kiss at all. It was because she suddenly had a headache. But she didn't have time to say anything, because Demus stood up from his seat and said that her face was all red and asked, "Was yesterday's kiss really so good that she couldn't even talk about it now?" Coming closer to the girl, the man said that if this was her first time, then he was incredibly happy that she liked it so much. Catherine was immediately surprised and asked if it was his first kiss. But the man asked why she was so surprised. Did he really look like a tyrant who changed women every night? At that moment, Demus came closer to her and, getting down on one knee, said that despite his appearance, he was a surprisingly decent person. And after that, the guy asked her to let him ask, is the girl ready to take responsibility for him for the rest of her life? Catherine didn't respond to this at first. She felt very awkward, because his lips were so close to hers, and at that moment memories of the previous evening began to surface in her mind. The girl, without thinking twice, immediately turned away from him and did not understand why she was even thinking about it at such a moment. And anyway, she should just forget about it, and then everything would be fine. When Catherine didn't respond, Damon suddenly said in a surprised voice that if she was so obviously avoiding it, then it was easy to understand what she was thinking. He moved closer to her and whispered in her ear, "Does she intend to tease him because she is disappointed that they couldn't go all the way yesterday?" Catherine immediately clutched the notes in her hand. She was very angry, but at the same time she was embarrassed. The girl, screaming, said that this was not so at all. The man, when he saw her hand, said that he was very interested in what kind of trash she was holding. Catherine said in a low voice that they were notes for music, but that wasn't enough for him. He snatched them from her hand and said he wanted to see them. Of course, Catherine was angry. She turned to His Highness and asked him to give them to her immediately. But Demus, meanwhile, was already smiling and said that even after it came to this, she still carried it with her, so he assumed that it was most likely a very valuable thing to her. Then he went up to the piano and, laying out the sheets of paper in front of him, got ready. Catherine, watching all this, was very surprised. She could not believe that he was actually going to play her notes, but she didn't understand how he was going to play the piano at all, because these were notes for a music box, and they were simply impossible to read. However, at that very moment, the man began to play, and Catherine heard a melody that was incredibly familiar to her. He had somehow managed to decipher these notes, and he played just perfectly. Catherine, of course, was very surprised. She could not believe that he was actually playing the song correctly. She also didn't understand how he could even know and specifically play the song that her father created for her. Without thinking twice, the girl stood up and, turning to His Highness, asked how he even knew about this song. Demus, meanwhile, smiled happily and said that she looked very surprised and asked if there was anything wrong with that, since he knew the song. Catherine was about to say something, but she didn't have time because he continued playing the piano and said that there was absolutely nothing he didn't know. After that, he looked at her and said that it was all because right now he was living the same life for the second time. So he knew all the events perfectly well. Once Catherine heard that he was living the same life for the second time, she was even more surprised. She couldn't believe that it could be true, so she assumed that it was probably one of his stupid jokes. But the man threw the notes on the ground and, stepping on them with his shoe, said that this was music. He knew it, because Protheon Caliburn played this melody for him a long time ago. Of course, Catherine was disappointed that he just went and trampled her notes, but she tried to restrain herself. In a quiet voice but with confidence, she told the man that these notes were a precious thing that her father had given her, saying that he had composed this melody especially for her. Demus suddenly smiled and, asking her forgiveness, said that this was not at all the composition that her late father had composed. That man did not know how to compose music. As soon as Catherine heard this, she was simply horrified. She clutched the cross that hung on her chest and in a trembling voice asked what he meant. Of course, she thought that this simply couldn't be true. After all, her father had clearly said that this was a song that he had created for her personally and had even given her these notes. But the guy replied that the song was actually a folk melody from Asakana, a funeral song used in a traditional ceremony. As soon as Catherine heard about Asakan, she was very surprised, because it was the proud name of those who lived a free life on the vast plains before the Empire captured them and humiliated them to the lowest rank. Radiant. This name was the original name of their pride, and it was called Asakan. It was forbidden for a former emperor of the Empire to use that name, so Catherine didn't understand how that was even possible. It is necessary, and you interrupted her thoughts, coming closer and closer, and said that she turns out to be a very honest person, and everything is revealed so clearly now. As he moved the girl towards the wall, he placed his hand behind her and said that it was now her turn to answer one question honestly. Smiling, he moved closer to Catherine and said that he would ask her again, who was his fiancé's first man? Catherine was very surprised and asked what he meant. And the man explained that he wanted to know the first person who courted her. He needed a name. She said with a trembling voice that it didn't really matter now. Besides, she had had so many relationships that she couldn't even remember who the first one was. But the man, making his voice rougher, said that she still lacked sincerity. He also said that, of course, lying is not a sin, but it is human nature. He then touched her cheek with his hand and said that when this lie has no effort, it can be very irritating for the listener. After she remained silent, the man began to move towards her chest and told her to think carefully, as he could wait until she remembered. Of course, Catherine didn't like what he was doing, so she sat down and covered her chest with her hands, telling him to wait. And then she asked him if it was really that important for him to know. When he looked at her in surprise, she said she couldn't believe he didn't care that half of her family line was radiant, and also that she is an unclean woman who had many relationships, even before marriage. But at that moment, the man knelt down and, touching her legs with his hands, said that if she meant this, then he himself was quite a depraved person. Demus lifted her skirt, spreading her legs, and began kissing her knees, asking if that didn't make them a perfect match. Of course, Catherine didn't expect him to do that at all. She felt very awkward, and she really didn't want him to do that. As soon as the man raised his head and saw her expression, he asked with a smile, "Can such an unclean woman as I really be embarrassed by such behavior?" He looked at her without taking his eyes off her and said that he wanted her to appreciate how he could be better than everyone else she had had before. Catherine, when he started doing these things, felt very strange. She was very hot, she kept blushing, and just sat with her eyes closed. In fact, she felt a rather strange feeling in her head again. But then suddenly the man rose higher to her and said that they had only just begun, and she could barely stand it. After that, he asked her what she would do next. When they moved on to a more intense phase, without waiting for an answer from the girl, he immediately began to passionately kiss her on the lips. Catherine understood that she could not do it anymore, so she would really faint again. The man already wanted to move on to the same thing that he had been doing before, but then suddenly he heard someone's voice. The voice came from below, and Demus immediately realized it was his assistant. He asked the guy to just say the message without going upstairs. His assistant, of course, listened and said that a chimera had been spotted near Caliburn's mansion, and asked if he should launch the Lanius Knights. Catherine quickly squeezed her legs together at this point to stop anything else from happening, and the men continued to talk. Demus asked them to gather everyone and await his further orders. Then the guy stood up and, turning to Catherine, said that he would give her one homework assignment because he now needed to take a short break. Walking away from her, he said that he wanted her to come up with a more convincing excuse for the next time they met. Soon he went down and left the tower completely, leaving the girl alone. Then the girl finally breathed a sigh of relief after spending some time in the tower. She returned back to the estate and went straight to her brother's room. Opening the doors, she asked if he was there. As soon as Lancelot saw her, he immediately, even a little angry, asked what she was doing in this place. But at that moment, the man who was sitting behind the chair turned to him and asked, Is this really the famous Lady Caliburn? Another guy said that it was really her, as beautiful as the rumors said. Of course, Lancelot was not pleased to hear all these things, and when he went out the door with his sister, he began to shout at her, saying that she should not come to him when he had guests. And anyway, he told her many times that the girl should just sit in her room. Catherine immediately apologized to him and said that she just thought he was alone, and that's why she wanted to talk. She explained that she was going through a bit of a tough time, and he was the only person she could think of and turn to. The girl, hanging her head down, said that she was really sorry that she had disturbed him and broken her promise. She also said that she would not do it again. As soon as Lancelot heard all this, he was very surprised because he did not know what she thought of him when she was having a hard time. He finally stopped being angry and, coming closer to the girl, hugged her, saying that he was asking for forgiveness for raising his voice at her because it was wrong. He also said that the meeting was almost over and asked if she could wait for him in her room during that time. Catherine asked, "Will he really have time to talk to her?" The man smiled and said that, of course, he would come to her right after his meeting was over. And so, after some time, when Lancelot came to the girl, he told her one thing that made her simply horrified. Catherine, in a trembling voice, asked what kind of marriage he was talking about, and also how he could even think about it. But the man saw nothing wrong with that. He said it was much safer to be his wife and have the protection of the Duke's family than to live her life keeping secrets with a dangerous man like Demus. Catherine jumped up and started yelling at him, asking if he had forgotten that incest was punishable by immediate execution. And besides, it was moral in her opinion. But the man, smiling, asked what incest she was talking about, and also wondered if she had forgotten that she had no traces of Caliburn's blood. She was a complete rediot. He simply asked her to honestly say that she was such a person, change herself in front of the Duke and the Imperial family, and then she could break off the engagement with him. Lancelot also said, smiling, that of course they could hold her accountable, but she shouldn't worry. He would take full responsibility and liability for everything that happened. Catherine was trembling with horror at what she had heard. She turned to her brother through clenched teeth and said that by revealing her identity, he was putting everyone in danger, and that it was not so easy to do. After this, she raised her voice and said that if it turned out that she was a pure rediot, then she would no longer be considered a human being or even an animal. She would be something lower than all that. Of course, it didn't matter how much he seemed to value her. Catherine would still have to bow and show proper respect every time one of the Duke's family passed by. But that wasn't all. She would be a mere plaything for Lancelot's pleasure and anyone else's, and Catherine would have no way of holding anyone accountable for it. Therefore, being a rediot, a person does not live. He simply exists. He is used by everyone who wants it. He has nothing in his power. And that's why Catherine pretended to be a low-born woman, in order to maintain her position as a half-blood region, because being of mixed blood means having dozens of disadvantages. But at least she has a chance for a better life. So Catherine couldn't understand at all how he could insist that she reveal her true identity. The girl started to leave, yelling at her brother, and said that she would pretend that she hadn't heard all of this, and they would just forget about it. But of course, the man was not satisfied with this option. He immediately stood up from his seat, ran up, and grabbing her hand, said that he loved her. He looked her straight in the eyes and said that he had never stopped loving her from the very beginning. He fell in love with her, but suppressed these feelings in himself, because at that time, it was considered that she was his relative. Catherine stood there dumbfounded, not knowing what to say to that, but simply asked, "Did he just say the word love?" But, not waiting for an answer from him, she began to scream and said that if he really loved her, he would never have said such things. But before the girl could finish her sentence, suddenly the doors to this room opened and Demus appeared there. He was dressed in his knight's uniform, and it made him look more masculine. The man stepped forward and said that she had told him she had done her homework. He asked with a smile on his face if she had decided to do it together with her brother, but she thought it was rather strange. As soon as Catherine saw him, she did not understand what he was doing in this place, because he had to go about his business. The girl was also scared by the fact that he could overhear everything that she discussed with her brother. Lancelot stood for a moment, then came forward and, turning to His Highness, said that he thought there had been some misunderstanding and asked if they could continue this conversation in a distant place. However, the man, without thinking twice, pulled out his gun and pointed it straight at Catherine's brother, saying that he did not want the man to interrupt when they were talking. Smiling, he looked at the girl and said that he was actually talking to his woman right now and would not tolerate anyone interfering with him doing so. At that moment, Catherine ran up to Demus and told him to lower his sword. But the guy said that if she really wanted him to do it, then she should come to him. Catherine was very surprised and asked what he meant, but the man replied that if she came and kissed him, he would consider fulfilling her request. The girl stood there and couldn't believe that he really wanted her to kiss him right in front of Lancelot. But Demus wondered what was going on. Wasn't she happy to see her future husband, who had defeated the Chimera and returned completely uninjured? Continuing to pull the sword towards her brother, he said that it was a bit impolite and terrible of her. Catherine, of course, was scared and said that of course it wasn't. She was just glad he had returned safely. At that point, she began to move closer to him, and at that moment, when Catherine was already next to his face, she stood on her toes and kissed him right on the lips. The man immediately lowered the sword to the other side. During the kiss, Demus didn't even close his eyes. He looked at Lancelot to watch his reaction, because he understood perfectly well that it would not be so cheerful. After the kiss was over, he smiled and said that in that case, he would forgive the Duke for his rudeness. Catherine, upon hearing this, immediately breathed a sigh of relief. She was happy that now no one would get hurt. However, His Highness now turned to her and inquired about her condition. He also asked whether she had been caught in the rain or whether someone had deliberately injured her. The girl didn't understand at all what he was talking about, but she assumed that he most likely meant what happened then in the tower. Demus moved closer to her and said that he had not finished the job, so he had to make sure to clean her out thoroughly. So, turning to her brother, he asked him to leave immediately. As soon as he heard about this, he immediately frowned and said that if it was really necessary, then he should call the maid to help the girl wash herself in peace. But Demus, angry, asked, did he really not hear him? Then, biting his teeth, he looked at him with an angry look and told the guy to get out of this room immediately. How could he say that if he forced him to say the same thing again, the Duchy of Caliber would disappear from the Empire forever, and it would be his fault alone? Catherine, of course, was very surprised, but she did not want to get involved in all these male squabbles. Her brother understood that in order not to anger him even more, he should simply agree, so he shook his head and began to leave. Meanwhile, the Duke of another empire took the girl by the hand and began to lead her towards the bathroom. As soon as they entered there, he immediately sat her down in a hot bath without even undressing her, and began to pour warm water on her head to warm her up thoroughly and wash her. The man took off his knightly uniform and asked her if she liked the bathroom, and if the discomfort she had been experiencing before had disappeared. Catherine was a little surprised. She didn't understand what was going on, but she said yes. The girl also even suggested that perhaps he hadn't heard her conversation with her brother. Then the girl thought about it and realized that if he had heard their entire conversation, he would have killed her brother right there on the spot. So she assumed that most likely the big crisis had already passed, and she could breathe a sigh of relief. Demus turned to Catherine and asked her to help him wash himself, because there was a lot of blood. The girl immediately said that she would do everything and began to dip her hand in the water. And then she wiped his face, which was splattered with blood. She kept her eyes on the man and noticed that with his eyes closed, he looked even more like a statue than usual. As she was wiping his cheek, she suddenly looked a little higher and noticed that he also had a bloody mark on his forehead. Of course, Catherine decided that she needed to wipe that down too, so she quickly got to work on it. And at the moment when she was about to wash his wound again, the man suddenly opened his eyes, after which he moved away from the girl. Demus suddenly asked, "Is she doing this on purpose?" The girl looked at him in surprise, not understanding what he even meant when he said such a thing. Then the guy came up to her, took her by the waist, lifted her up in his arms, saying that he meant that she was touching him in a seductive way. Of course, as soon as Catherine heard this, she was very surprised and suddenly noticed that the man was quite tall because he lifted her in his arms and she was very high from the ground. The girl did not expect this and suddenly even became scared because she was always afraid of heights. So as she hugged her fiancé around the neck, she knew she might even fall if she wasn't careful. As soon as the girl did this, Demus immediately smiled smugly and said that she was clinging to him just like a little kitten who was afraid of falling into the water. After that, he laughed and said that he thought he should start calling her Kitty instead of Catherine. The girl, hearing about this, was a little surprised and did not understand what all this was necessary for, but, of course, she could not dissuade him from it. After he carried her out of the bathroom, He cleared the dressing table that was next to the bed and sat the girl right on it. He was quite close to Catherine and asked her what she thought about him finishing the service he had been unable to complete earlier because his unforgettable subordinate had interrupted them. Catherine, of course, immediately remembered what had happened in the tower and was very scared. She asked in a trembling voice, "Did he really want to do it right there?" But Demus smiled and asked, "What difference does it make?" And he wondered if she was the kind of person who was going to do such things in the pantry. But, moving away from her a little, he sighed and asked, was she really afraid that it would be cruel, unlike her brother Lancelot? But he said that she should not be afraid about this, because he would definitely make sure that everything was gentle and neat. Catherine asked what he was even talking about and also replied that her brother was her family, so she didn't understand how he could even think of such a thing. But Demus said in a quiet voice that they weren't really a family. As soon as the girl heard this, she immediately looked at him in surprise and asked what he was saying. The Duke began to move closer to her and said that her brother had spoken about this before and asked, "Isn't it true?" He repeated the words of her false brother, who said that there was not a single drop of Caliburn's blood in her veins. With a smile on his face, Demus said that her brother had said that. Catherine was simply horrified and didn't know what to even say to him. Her body suddenly began to tremble. Now she realized that he had heard their entire conversation with her brother from beginning to end. Of course, Demus knew perfectly well that Lancelot was hiding this on purpose, just to see his reaction. The man began to move closer to Catherine and said that the Osakan was practically the property of the family and asked, "Is this true?" When she shook her head in refusal, he asked who was the toy in someone's bed. He wondered if her father was really Proton Caliburno, and considering how close they were, her brother was also Lancelot. The girl lowered her head and realized that as soon as it was clear that she was a Rediot, she did not understand how he could continue to insult her in any way. She looked at her fiancé and, clasping her hands together, said that she had always lived as Catherine Calibur, not as a slave or anything else. She was an equal among others, and she was quite content with that life. Her hands were shaking. She said that it was all a lie, told to hide the fact that she was a Rediot, so she begged him to just kill her for trying to deceive him in society and not to put her to suffer. Of course, the girl understood perfectly well that if the Duke was offended by this situation, he would certainly kill the entire family for trying to introduce a beast into the Imperial family. And that means he's just going to destroy them. And Catherine would rather bear all the sins for all of this herself than in front of this family that took her in and allowed her to live like a normal person. The man was silent for a while. Then he smiled and said that in a situation like this, she could try to determine her own punishment. He also said that she was so self-confident that everyone might even think that she was a princess. But after that, he got down on one knee in front of her and said that he wanted to know, had she really never had any experience with men before this moment? Catherine was, of course, surprised by such a question, but she immediately replied that she had never touched a man in her entire life. Demus grabbed her leg at that moment and started climbing higher and higher, wondering if this was really true. But in that case, he wanted to give her one last chance. The man, smiling, said that if she could prove that he was her man and that it was only him, then Demus would fulfill her request and kill only her and would not touch her family. But continuing to look into her eyes without taking his eyes off her, he said that if this turned out to be another lie, then in that case he would kill absolutely everyone and leave her alive so that she would blame herself. As soon as Catherine heard this, she was surprised, but it was a great opportunity, and she said that she swears, and this time her words are really the pure truth. The girl understood that this was her only chance to protect her family, so she could not miss it. Then he started to climb under her skirt and asked why they didn't start with a light check. As soon as Catherine heard this, she was very surprised and asked, shouldn't her frequency be confirmed by a priest? Damon, still smiling, asked what kind of boring conversation they were having. At that moment, he took off her underwear and, putting it to his mouth, said that she smelled very sweet. After that, he got back on level terms with her and asked her if she would like to know what she really tasted like. Catherine didn't even have time to understand what he meant before the man began kissing her right on the lips. Of course, she thought it was all very strange and didn't understand why she felt so uneasy. When he had finished kissing her, she turned to His Highness and asked if he could finish it all very quickly. As soon as Damon heard this, he was very surprised at first and did not know what to answer her to this and how to react at all. But then he smiled and said that she apparently knew how to speed up all these events. In order to make concessions to her, he said that he would hurry up and some time passed from that moment. They finished their dirty deeds, and the man, moving away from Catherine, said that apparently it really was her first time. The girl said that it was indeed so, and then asked if this proved what she had said earlier. The man immediately said that it did. But Catherine felt very strange. But at the same time, she felt incredible relief, because now she would not have to live like a beast, because he would simply kill her. But at the same time, leave her family alive. However, in this case, she would be able to die with a worthy person by her side, and this made Catherine very happy. Some time passed since then, and when Catherine fell asleep, she had a rather strange dream in which she and Damon participated. This guy was sitting in a dark place, tied by the neck to the wall, and Catherine ran up to him and apologized for being a little late. She had a whole basket of baked goods in her hands, and she said that she had brought a lot of food this time, so she really hoped that he would forgive her for being late. But when the girl sat down next to him and noticed the bruises on his hands, she asked where he got these wounds from. Damon sighed heavily and said that she never came, and that this made him very scared.